Hi, my name's Jacob Windsor, and I'm going to teach you a little bit about what I learned from Bravais Lattice. So, first, if I can get to the right. Okay, there we go. So, first, the Bravais Lattice, its discovery. It was discovered in the 1800s by Moritz Ludwig Frankenheim and August Bravais. And Frankenheim was a Jewish German physicist who lived in the 1800s, and he did extensive research on crystallography, and he actually proposed that there were 15 types of lattice structures. And then along came after him Auguste Bravais, who proved that there were not 15 but actually 14 bravais or lattices. And the 15th was rotation or translation or symmetry of one of the previous 14. And he published this in 1848, and later the lattice types were named after him, and we call them Bravais lattices today. So, what makes a Bravais lattice? I'm going to move my head for a second. So, a Bravais lattice is it's a class of crystal structure. So here we have 2D crystal structures, or 2D Bravais lattices and 3D Bravais lattices. There are 5 different 2D Bravais lattices and 14 different 3D Bravais lattices. And more commonly, we think of them in 3-dimensional space, but we'll just go through the 2-dimensional ones really quickly. We have, I believe, 4 different types. They're tetragonal, monoclinic, tetragonal, square, and rectangular. And we have 2 types of rectangular. Those are primitive rectangular and centered rectangular. And then in 3-dimensional space, we have 14 different types, and those are actually classified into either 6 or 7 different families. Technically 6, but that can be considered 2 different ones. One of the families can be considered 2 different families. So we have the triclinic, the monoclinic, orthorhombic, tetragonal, trigonal, and actually this is the hexagonal, these 2. And they're split into the hexagonal on the left here, or this rhombic on the right. And finally, the last one is cubic. And each of these are also divided into 4 different types of structure, which are primitive or simple. Let's see. Body-centered, face-centered, and base-centered. So if you combine the 6 or 7 different families with the 4 different types, there's not one lattice for each type, because that would make about 24, 28. Some have fewer than the total, but that's where you get the 14 different lattice types. So a Bravais lattice is defined by one particle at its corner, and that's its base particle. So from this particle, we can define 3 different basis vectors, and those are actually what define the Bravais lattice. So these vectors can have different magnitudes and different angles. Some can be 90 degrees, some can be 120 degrees. The Bravais lattices don't match in their angles, they don't match in the vector lengths, or maybe they do match in the vector length, and all those decide what type of Bravais lattice it is. Okay, now we'll talk about applications. So before we talk about applications, we need to know about defects. So in crystal structure, there's actually always going to be defects, and those are going to be either most commonly interstitial defects or vacancy defects. Now, interstitial defects are where you have an extra particle or an extra element or compound in between the spaces where the particles would go. So basically, you have your Bravais lattice, and then you'll have an extra particle in there that shouldn't be in there. And vacancy defects are actually the opposite. So in your Bravais lattice, where there should be a particle, there isn't one. So those are the two most common types of defects, and those can contribute to something known as slippage, which is shown here, and this is called a slip plane, where the lack of particles or the excess number of particles can form new bonds, and those have high energy levels and they will split apart and slip. And so that can affect the metallurgical mechanical properties such as the strength of the metal, and actually there are different ways of treating metals to make them stronger. So this is directly affecting the crystal structure. We have the heat treatment, which is a very common treatment for strength treating method in engineering industries. And that's where a metal is heated, and we have these three steps in this. So it's first heated, and that starts the recovery process. And in the recovery process, the high energy stored within the defective, maybe it's not defective, but the high energy stored where there are defects in the crystal structure, it starts to release and rearrange the different structures. Then in recrystallization, we have the structures form new bonds with each other, or the particles form new bonds with each other, and that's where we get, here we have new crystals. And then finally we have grain growth. So these grains or crystal structures, once they form the new bonds, they begin to grow and, not eliminate, but reduce the number of defects in the metal or the material. And here on the right, we have a common example showing a heat treatment. So now we'll talk about the properties of the crystal structure, or the Bravais lattice. So the most common is probably anisotropy, which is basically the grains have a preferred direction. So as the grains grow, they'll grow elongated in one direction, and that can make the metal stronger in that direction or weaker. So here we use this in sheet rolling. So you have to think about when you sheet roll, you have to think about the preferred direction of the grains, so that when you sheet roll it, you're not weakening the grains even further. So you want to make sure you have it against its preferred direction. And then we can talk about the strength of the Bravais lattice. So here we show an engineering stress strain diagram, and this shows the force the material can take over how much it's being stretched. So this stretching is actually stretching out the crystal structure, the Bravais lattices, and it's pulling them apart. It just shows how much force it can take before those crystal structures will actually physically break and not form new bonds. So that's about it for crystal structures. Or Bravais lattices. If you want more information, I recommend this book, Material Science and Engineering, by William Callister and David Rethwish. And that's where I got most of my information. So thank you.